I want to introduce, again, the main act. It's a great pleasure to welcome David Sweeney from HEFCE to join us this afternoon and to give us his reflections on public engagement and these related activities. David has very wide experience of the higher education sector. His current role is as Director for Research, Innovation and Skills at HEFCE, the Higher Education Funding Council for England. He is responsible for research policy and funding, research assessment exercise, and research excellence framework were within his responsibilities, but we forgive you, David, really. It's a very wide portfolio that he covers. He has also been involved in some really key activities that affect the research activity of universities in the UK, not least the involvement with the Finch Group on this open access to publications, a very live issue, and was part of the group that came up with some I think very enlightened suggestions about the way forward nationally for open access publishing. So David's background, and indeed his current remit, is very broad, which will enable him, I'm sure, to make some very perceptive comments about the area of public engagement. David is always stimulating in his comments, and I'm sure he will be no less so today. I think, David, you're planning to speak for only a portion of the allotted time to allow some opportunity for discussion. David, welcome, and thank you.
Thanks very much, Simon. It's truly a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to visit QM. I do struggle to keep up with the acronym of the moment, but it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. It's a special pleasure. I've got to be here in a maths building. What's that? Goodness gracious me. I did maths at university. I'll refer to Aberdeen in a moment. 4 years, indeed, with the chalkboard in front of you, and that great experience of them writing a series of things at the end of which, at the end of each line, they'd say, therefore. And you'd think, how did they get from there to there? And my experience was to quite often be able to work it out, but by the time I'd worked it out, they were 4 steps further down the line. And I was lost. So it's a pleasure to be in the maths building, pleasure to be here, and I'm incredibly grateful to Simon for starting from the place we must start, the intellectual purposes of a university. I've been going around for some time talking about impact. I'm normally accused of instrumentalism, as if that was an evil word. I'm quite comfortable with that. Surely, a university, which is a complex and multifaceted operation, can balance intellectual pursuits with practical and instrumental pursuits. I think Simon's made clear that the traditional purposes of a university are such that public engagement is a natural outcome. Well, so I believe. My University Aberdeen was established in 1495, and there was a papal bull of the time that established the university. And to summarise it, it was to educate the savages in that region. You'll judge tonight whether it was successful with at least one person, but it was quite an explicit impact agenda of the time. And indeed, the knowledge of intellectual pursuit for its own sake was probably not really understood in those days. But over hundreds of years, that aspect of university life has been developed, and it has waxed and waned. Universities in England were completely detached from the Enlightenment. Universities in Scotland were engaged in the Enlightenment. Very different approaches to universities. And indeed, drawing on a speech that your principal gave in another place, the whole Humboldtian concept of a university developed in Germany in the 19th century was about a view of universities, research, teaching, out of which engagement came naturally. And John Henry Newman, Cardinal Newman in Ireland, just didn't see universities as research organisations. He saw them as primary teaching vehicles. And when he's quoted approvingly, as quite often happens, I do wonder if people have read what he wrote and understand the broader framework of his discussion. I think that today we face real challenges, and I think we do have to move from history into what universities are for today. I started in a university actually about 9,000 days ago, 20 years, at Royal Holloway, and I entered what I thought was a backwater. Universities of the time, particularly a very small college of the University of London, were not prominent in public life. I think it's fair to say. You could read the broadsheet newspapers for weeks on end without seeing any significant reference to university life. Now, of course, it's quite difficult to read a broadsheet newspaper for more than a few days without some incredibly controversial aspect of university life, most recently funding cropping up. Universities were, of course, there for the few. Even when I went to university, about 8% of folk went to university. You could understand that the role they played in society, although important in training for the professions and the like, was much, much less. The intellectual discourse, well, there were those talks on Radio 3 where people who smoked pipes and spoke with a certain accent talked about subjects which perhaps were only fit for Radio 3. Where are we today? Roughly half of people 30 years and under have had some sort of university engagement. About 38% or so of 18-year-olds go to university. We almost brought a government with a majority of 160-odd to its knees when Tony Blair first brought in fees and was reduced to a majority of 4. We almost fractured a coalition government in the current government. Indeed, one might argue we've ruined the Liberal Democrats for a generation by the latest developments. Now, good or bad for now is not the issue, and certainly the funding settlement has proved beneficial for universities, albeit a very considerable challenge for the graduates paying back over 30 years or so. But the debate on student funding is at the heart of political discussions. And this is not a UK phenomenon. Those of you who follow what happens down under will see that a major feature of the Australian budget this week was indeed the uncapping of student numbers and the uncapping of fees, actually, in their place. And in every country around the world, and I've been involved with OECD, how do you fund the fact that more people should go to university? The future of every developed country is in the intellectual capital that its inhabitants develop. That comes primarily from universities. We are at the heart of society in a way that we weren't 20 years ago and certainly not 40 years ago. In economic discourse too, well, we've had a big burden placed on us. Universities are at the heart of recovery. The heart of growth has been one of the government lines for some years now. And although we may be uncomfortable with being placed at the heart of an economic recovery, the reality in many parts of this country is that there is no alternative. The university is the only body of any size which has discretionary money for investment, is the largest or second largest employer in the area, is the future for those who want to aspire to a job, just putting it bluntly. The university is, in some parts of our country, the only game in town. So there's no hiding, really, from the economic role, even although I think, well, I certainly would be uncomfortable with that being the only characterization of the university, and why I'm so pleased that your principal began with the right starting point, our intellectual pursuits. I think all of this has come over many years with a substantial public investment, even in the new environment where indeed there's a tremendous burden on graduates to pay back. We all know that the amount of money which will not be paid back is, well, pick a number. We started at 30, we're now heading towards 50. So half the cost of university still falls on the public purse. It is still an investment made not just by those who go to university, but taxpayers. There is a responsibility involved in that. We are, of course, grounded in our communities. More of that in a moment, and with a responsibility because we are very large employers, because we are often the centre of cultural life. How do we work out those tensions with our research mission and our teaching mission? Well, actually, we do it in exactly the terms that Simon has referred to, not as partitioning, but as thinking it all together. Now, my own experiences are slightly strange, because I went to Royal Holloway, where I worked for many years, and was actually vice principal, including for public engagement, communications, we called it. And I found great difficulty in getting to grips with that role, because Royal Holloway is one of, I think, the very few universities in the country which has no community. It is located in a village. It has a town of 10,000, just a few hundred yards down the road. And once you go to, that's Egham, once you go to the next town, Staines, a place of great popularity, if you ask them about Royal Holloway, they'd go, Royal Holloway? And they may know people who worked there, but it's in no sense at the centre of a community. This is, in my view, a great drawback for the place. And I found it a great struggle to work out how we could engage when, in fact, we had no natural community to engage with. And yet we did run some cultural stuff, but we weren't in any sense a centre in the way that I think you are, and in the way, actually, that most universities are. So I think to work out our role, I think we've got to tease out what that responsibility entails, and the people that we interact with to whom we can discharge that responsibility. And in that, I think there's no easy model, which is a pity, because in most of what universities do, there's umpteen models. Actually, one for each university, you sometimes think. But of course, there are models which you can learn from. And going back to the Humboldtian concept, you can look at a whole host of universities in the States that stemmed straight out of that. You can look at the land grant universities in Australia who, well, were quite literally granted their land by the state to become the focal point for education and knowledge in the area. If you look at the UK, the civic universities were not established for any other reason than to be civic universities. Now, of course, they do research, they do teaching, but they are at their heart civic universities. And indeed, one of my delights is, because I've had the privilege of going round the world talking about this, mostly in the context of impact. The Australian National University is also a university that doesn't have any real community about it. If any of you have been to Canberra, it's a very, very strange town indeed. Obviously, a new essentially post-war city, and largely staffed by bureaucrats. I say that since I am now one, and by public servants. No natural community, and established, they say, to be the intellectual heart of the nation and a research powerhouse. But then you look back at the founding charter and you say it says nothing like that at all. It says it is there to support the nation of Australia in all that it does. So I think there are different models, but each of us has to work it out in the context of the responsibility that we feel. And that's where it's so exciting for me to look round the poster presentation and see how you each have teased out that responsibility. I was going to ask Peter or Bill whether that was top-down activity dictated by the university strategy. Funnily enough, I'm getting heads shaken at me. Well, of course it wasn't. No university can dictate what its people do at any level of detail. A university is about the combined and creative powers of its staff and its students. So I think teasing out that responsibility is a challenge. I'm going to look at a number of specific challenges there are, and then I want to pose for you a challenge to look at an alternative model, as it were, and think about how that plays out in the university context. So what are the challenges that I see to establish successful engagement from a university? Shall we mark QM out of 10 on each of those? No, perhaps that would be invidious. This is a list which our National Centre for Public Engagement has developed. The commitment to engagement in institutional strategies is critical. You've got to be free to do it and encouraged to do it. Since you've got a vice principal for it, it had better be in your strategy, or your governance is in a bit of a pickle. I know that's not the case. But then it gets a bit more challenging. The embedding of engagement should be seen as a long game, evolution rather than revolution. New academic norms are emerging, that's, I think, obvious, and many younger academics who would be the middle and senior managers of the future have to embrace engagement as a necessary and vital part of their professional identity. Now, I see that as a challenge in a number of ways. There's an awful lot of short-term pressures on a university. Senior staff serve for relatively short periods. Governing bodies turn over in relatively short periods. 8 years would be quite a long period of service on a governing body. The funding system seems to change every 5 years, although it's not always as bad as that. There is now greater uncertainty in what group of students you will have. Research themes change quite regularly, and it's always easier to play to the immediate demands. The call that's just come out from the research councils for such and such, how do we do that, is indeed, of course, impact today's story and not tomorrow's. How do universities engage with the long game when, like actually businesses, they're under tremendous pressure for short-term results? I think that's a real challenge and a tribute to senior teams and to their academics if you can take a long-term view. I think too, and I'll say a bit more about this later, it's very easy to think in certain terms about success. Getting your 4 publications for the ref out clearly is necessary. Making sure that they're all whatever your standard is before you submit is a further challenge. Ensuring that you've got enough students on your course now, particularly if you're doing courses with substantial numbers of overseas students. I remember one year we had a little bit of a flutter in the Dovecots at Royal Holloway, and numbers didn't look good for next year. We just dispatched 3 of our academics to the Far East and said, don't come back till you've recruited so many students. That sounds a bit cruel, but actually it's not much different from that. Go and make some contacts, go and see where we can do something new. A very short-term pressure, exacerbated, I might say, by a governing body that took a very short-term view, and the senior management team responded. So I think the short, long-term thing is quite important. I think it's very difficult to do public engagement with only a short-term focus. Just if you're involved in alumni and development work, there is nothing worse than playing it hard for 3 years and then dropping it and doing something different. Critical to be in the strategy, critical to be willing to take a long-term view, which is difficult. Critical, I think, that you have specialists to help. And I think It's really a challenge in every aspect of university life where there is the possibility of specialist support. But of course that specialist support costs money. Do we hire another academic, or do we have? Is really quite a difficult question. I do notice that universities seem to find no trouble in hiring people to help them with their REF submissions. So the systems are there to do it. But the same thing applies indeed to alumni and development, to certain kinds of new technology and teaching support. Where do you invest in specialists? Because, of course, specialists cannot do the work. They can only support what is done by the academics. How inclusive is this, I think, is also a challenge. Nothing worse, in my view, if you're in a department where Joe over there, he does the public engagement. We've let him off a bit of his teaching. Oh, and he didn't quite make it for the ref, you know, only 2.5 outputs. I think sharing in the way that I hope collegiately departments do what is done, and sharing the vision is, to my view, a big challenge. These things are easily said and much more tricky to do. And then lastly in my list of things, although I'm sure you could think of a number of others, how much is it centralised and how much is it localised? There is a limit to bottom-up activity, because eventually you have to draw on resources, and fitting things into teaching allocations and aligning it with research time is, in my view, a very significant challenge at whatever level you manage those things, departmental level or whatever. So encouraging the kind of, well, let's face it, creative but impassioned activity that happens, that is driven by those who have a vision for it, that's important. Equally, trying to ensure that you are managing your resources effectively is quite a challenge. These are all challenges. For the universities, how do you support it? We've touched on that. How do you recognise and reward it? Simplistic views, oh well, so-and-so can get promoted because of public engagement or commercialisation or one of the many other things, I think are very tricky. It's a very mature university that can have a discussion about things like promotion and appointments criteria and have a balance rather than a particular interest in any activity. Not all universities, frankly, are mature about this. And I think the answer is not just we wrote it in our promotion criteria or appointments criteria. It's the practice that counts. It's the understanding of departments as well-rounded groups of people who between them can do everything that is required. And of course I do remind you that things like promotions criteria are rarely dictated by the principal, or if you try it, it doesn't usually work. This is something that the academic body is inherently connected to, and it's therefore about the sense of self-worth and peer respect that colleagues have for themselves and for each other. And I think that too is, if I had to pick out a number of challenges, that is one of the significant ones. We all know that folk enter an academic career with a number of objectives and aspirations in mind. Very few get their papers published in Nature, win Nobel Prizes, and become the kind of glorious academic, publish the monograph that sets the direction for their discipline for the next 20 years. Not everybody can do that, and yet our universities need the collective efforts of all of their academics and must respect and reward work of all kinds. That, I think, is difficult, especially given the pressures there are driven by evil people like me to allocate funding in fairly narrow ways. And what about funders? Before we came up, I was asked, so what about this impact criteria then? So you recognise impact that arises from specific, citable, excellent research. Yeah, that's good, we understand that. But what about and then I got given examples of activity that either arose not from specific pieces of research, but from the body of work that was going on in the department. Or indeed, one can say, why, in any event, should we be recognising impact that comes from research at all? What isn't impact of any kind worthy of recognition? Now, and of course, it's all my fault, the way we're doing it. It is my fault, actually. I don't say that in a joke. I did coordinate the criteria, although not personally decide them. And I think these are good questions. The good thing, though, is that they're not questions to which a settled answer has been given. We have run an exercise that did a particular thing. Now we stop and we talk. We get feedback, and the community together decides what is right for the way forward. We don't have to do impact the way we've done it. We took the view that, of course, public engagement itself is not necessarily impactful, that what we were doing with a research assessment exercise, or research excellence exercise, was about looking at the quality of research, and we wanted to capture not just that research was carried out, but that there was an outcome in societal terms from it. We thought that was right, and indeed we consulted about it, and you collectively thought that was right, but now we maybe know better. It is up to you all to participate in the discussions there are about how we might do things differently next time. What have we learned? What will support the collective purpose of a university better in terms of the exercise that we run, and indeed have to run if we're going to justify public investment in research. Now, I really can't emphasize how much of a challenge that is to you, and how often it is that we do what we do because people come up with bright ideas and we adopt them. Indeed, the Finch Group, which I might say was an exciting experience, we changed our open access policy for the next REF as a result of the consultation and some wonderful ideas. The principles actually remained the same. The practicalities changed because better people than us came up with good ideas. So the challenge is there to you to control your own destiny. But just a pause on the concept of funders. A line given to me by some is, why don't you just have a public engagement stream, David? Why don't you fund it directly? It would pay for the professionals, it would buy people out, indeed as we do with the Higher Education Innovation Fund, HEFCE. Why don't we do it? To which my answer is we could, but there's two problems. First of all, if we do that, we just have, because every penny we get, we give to universities. We spend none of it on ourselves. The money for actually allowing me to travel down here, it comes out of a completely separate budget. We give away every penny we've got. The question, therefore, is, should we top slice in order for a particular purpose? And we do that occasionally. But we don't like doing it, because we think if universities are independent organisations capable of autonomous self-government, as many as possible of the decisions ought to be taken in the university. They shouldn't be taken in HEFCE Central or indeed in Whitehall. University business relations are different, quite simply because we've got extra money to do it. And we've continued to get that extra money. And if the government was to come along and say, would you like £150 million for public engagement? Of course, we'd say yes. We think that's currently unlikely. So should we top slice to do it? Well, we don't think so. Although if everybody tells us they want, the Vice-Chancellors tell us they want to do it, we will indeed do it. We don't think that's sensible. But there's a deeper point, in my view, than that, which relates to the autonomous, self-governing university. I don't like the line, we will do what you pay us to do. Because where is the autonomy in that? Where is the understanding of the community that you are in and the part you play in it? Where is your understanding of the country that you are in and the part you play in it? Indeed, the world you are in and your international role. if you only do what somebody pays you to do. Are you, in universities, tradesmen? And clearly, you're not. So I think that it should be only in exceptional circumstances that universities are paid to do specific things, and it should be for universities themselves to understand the social responsibility they have, along, of course, with the intellectual responsibility, and work out what they do. You could call this a naive faith in universities to do the right thing. And you'd be right. It is a faith in universities to do the right thing. Perhaps not in every individual challenge that they face. But I believe, for my part, having worked in universities for 20 years, having helped run a university, and now being at the heart of university government relations, that we should trust you as being communities of the highest intellectual calibre, who understand what your social responsibility is and work it out. I think on many aspects of university life, if universities cannot demonstrate they're taking that responsibility seriously, then it undermines not only the case for public funding, but their position in the nation. And I think that would be a real challenge. Universities are far more nationally prominent. I think that's a good thing, because I believe that in our academic communities and in all of our university employees, we have an outstanding group of people who I want to trust for the future. And I, therefore, one of the reasons why I go around banging at Impact is because I think this is a way of helping, but also forcing, colleagues to face up to those challenges. Public engagement, of course, is a wonderful outworking of that. And nobody could but fail to go round the poster exhibition and not have their heart warmed that a naive faith in universities is the right thing to do. I do also, it has to be said, encounter some self-serving comments from universities, and I'm afraid I don't mind challenging those, because our future does lie, in my view, in taking that social responsibility seriously. Now, to finish off, I want to stop talking for a moment about universities and start talking about the press. You'll see why in a few minutes. And I want to just go interactive for a moment. I want you to tell me, can we shout out? Can we do that? Some positive features about the press. I'm not thinking of where they are today, but the press as part of UK society, as it were, as an institution. Good features of the press?
Wide distribution.
Wide distribution.
Investigative journalism.
Investigative journalism, which one could tease out, I think, quite a bit challenging, both individuals and institutions in society. Yes.
Ability to write for a large audience.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Championing public ownership of ideas at Bengal Baker.
Yes.
Or ideas and research and information.
Yes. Yes. All true. Well, let's stop there. I think we could go up. What about flip side? Bad ideas? Bad things about the press? Perhaps with a... Well, actually, I was going to say, perhaps with a contemporary focus, but Oscar Wilde had things to say about that, so I think it isn't just contemporary.
Focus on entertainment.
Mm-hmm. Bias, yes.
Simplification of ideas.
Simplification of ideas, yes.
Well, phone hacking.
Phone hacking, yes. I mean, just plain corruption, lying, evil, yes.
Tabloid journalism.
Tabloid journalism, yeah. All true. Yeah.
Poor on error correction. If they make a mistake, it's quite hard to catch
Yes.
them.
Yes. Yes. Now, those are all true, and one could go on. You could talk. Well, in fact, let's just talk briefly. Let's think about the international influence that UK journalism has. Papers all over the world essentially copying the British model, and that's even before Rupert Murdoch took over half the papers around the world. One of my, for various reasons, I spend quite a time lot of time reading the international press and the English language, I'm afraid. It's amazing how often the same story crops up, and you can get great British stories from reading other countries' press. But no, international influence I would pick out as well, and indeed you could select national influence. Now, what do we call the press? What is it? It is the fourth estate. It's the first three estates are the Church, the Lords, and the Commons. And the role of the fourth estate, which is a phrase that means effectively a body that you identify as being influential to challenge those other three institutions, the fourth estate. My proposition to you, and also challenge, is that the new fourth estate, the press having abdicated its responsibility to be so called, in my view, the challenge is, are universities the new fourth estate? Not fulfilling the news dissemination purposes of the press, because that's not actually what makes them the fourth estate, but exactly the reasons you gave, challenging others, propagating freely and without bias ideas. And I think every one, I didn't write them down, I should have written them down, every one of the attributes you gave good about the press could be applied to universities. However, the worry is that every one of the negative things you said about the press is a temptation for universities. Universities should, in my view, be campaigning organisations on the basis of the evidence they have. And I think we've already seen examples of universities campaigning on not on any well-developed intellectual argument, but the prejudices of the academics. We've certainly seen universities in cultural and entertainment terms. Of course, if that becomes the focus, it detracts from the intellectual purity, I don't want to overplay that, of a university. I think, when do we get things wrong? We get things wrong. Today there's a story on the BBC website about the statins paper from the BMJ being retracted. It hasn't actually been retracted yet. A very interesting story. First of all, the challenge has come from one university to another, Rory Collins at Oxford. Are we willing, as an academic community, to be serious about retracting things we got wrong? Because, let's be honest, we do get things wrong. Although I'm not sure that statin story was a British university, as it happens. So I put it to you that we could learn a lot from the press. In my view, we should aspire to, without perhaps making a big deal of it, to be the fourth estate, because we have taken over their place in public life, and we retain the best attributes that the press had, but we are tempted by some of the things that have gone wrong. Let's be honest, higher education is now tempted by corruption. And we've already seen, not in the publicly funded sector, but in the privately funded HE sector in this country, students supposedly signed up from abroad, generating a call on public funds that turns out to be fraudulent. And I think it's also fair to say that we've seen some temptations in the public universities to stray near the bounds of ethical behaviour, which is perhaps the first step that there was on the press's road to damnation. So we work in some ways in a market environment where we're not for money, but we're competing for students. Ethics really matters. Now, we are liberal institutions with the highest standards, but there's a temptation. So I'd like to finish, in my view, by saying there is an enormous challenge to universities to work out their social responsibility. The practical challenges are truly immense. There is a dual, in my view, to be achieved. We've already got national prominence. I think we can build on that national prominence by sticking to the values that we hold dear, but there's risks involved also. If we are going to navigate our way through, it will not be done by our Vice-Chancellors working alone. It will be done by the whole academic community, with leadership shown by many in that, and by other media being used. The conversation is a new venture where academics speak directly to the public in journalism. So even on core territory, we are undermining the press. Do we want to be, in truth, the fourth estate, holding our other institutions to account? And is public engagement and social responsibility at the heart of that? Thanks very much.